Hi everybody, TheHande, a.k.a. here. Welcome to this shitty couch vlog / He-Man video where I decided I wanted to talk about something that I've never really discussed in any of my He-Man videos. Primarily I've always focused on the Filmation He-Man series because that's my favorite series, and by that extension I've also talked a fair bit about She-Ra Princess of Power. I know I'm doing the 60 seconds He-Man reviews on the new adventures as well. But really the Filmation version of He-Man is the one that is my personal favorite. But today I've decided that I wanted to spare a few words for the original He-Canon. That is to say, the original canon of the Masters of the Universe toy line. Yes, a lot of people forget sometimes that the toy line, which spawned He-Man, was originally just called Masters of the Universe. They didn't start adding He-Man to the title until the cartoon came out. And what a lot of people don't necessarily remember is that a lot of the lore associated with He-Man originated on the pages of comics. And no, I'm not talking about the DC comics that came out just before the cartoon show. I'm talking about the comics produced by Mattel themselves that came along with the toys, referred to widely in the fan community as the He-Man mini-comics. Now, I say comics, they were really just glorified picture books with a story narration at the bottom and some illustrations. And even though it is the accepted terminology, I've never really liked the term mini-comic, so I'll be just referring to them as the original comics. Now, it is true that Mattel eventually teamed up with DC to create more of these comics, and also they gave DC some freedom to broaden the lore of the series a little bit from what they originally created with the first line. But at the very start, these comics were indeed produced by Mattel themselves, who just hired the artists to do the illustrations for them. Now, the funny thing about the original toy canon of the series is that not only is it horribly inconsistent, and I've stated before that the Filmation show's canon is occasionally a bit fluid. Because of the way the Filmation cartoon was produced with a whole bunch of different writers and directors, there wasn't an extremely strict quality control in regards to continuity. Scriptwriters who penned multiple episodes of the show would of course try to maintain some consistency with the lore, but it was not uncommon to have a weird one-off element in an episode here or there. But if the Filmation show canon was a little fluid, the Mattel toy line canon was practically water. Because not only did Mattel eventually just fuse the Filmation cartoon's lore into the toy line, they actually also did it for the 1987 Masters of the Universe movie, which very clearly isn't set in the same continuity with the Filmation cartoon. Mattel didn't care. If an idea seemed good enough to include in the toy line, they would just put it in there. But that's not what I really wanted to talk about. I really wanted to talk about the very, very first wave of these mini-comics and talk a little bit about how the series looked like at the very start and how much it changed over time. Because the most striking thing about the original Mattel He-Man is just how much more bare bones the original lore was. A lot of the things that I think most fans of Masters of the Universe kind of assume are just universal things that have always been a part of this franchise are just flat out missing in those very early Masters of the Universe comics. So the things that are missing from those very first comics, Prince Adam, Snake Mountain, the Sorceress, and of course Duncan's mustache. Now I've actually touched upon this a little bit in my super old He-Man Facts video from the He-Man Review Series 3 that I did a long time ago. But now let's dive in a little deeper. And let's start talking about He-Man himself. Now, like I already mentioned, in the original Mattel toy line, He-Man did not have a secret identity. Originally, he was not Prince Adam. In fact, he was not royalty of any real description. In the original toy line, He-Man is literally just a barbarian warrior living in a tribe in the wilderness who goes out to find the characters that are presented as the bad guys in the series. I also mentioned in the original video how He-Man's original weapon of choice wasn't actually the power sword, it was an axe. We'll come back to that in just a second. It's actually Skeletor who I think is way more interesting in the original canon than he is in the later adaptations. Because to be honest, in the later variations, Even though Skeletor is one of my favorite characters, he is kind of a stereotypical villain. He's just on some quest to increase power or alternately conquer Eternia or take over Castle Grayskull. And don't get me wrong, Skeletor's goals are very similar to that in the original toy line, but there's an element that has been omitted almost entirely from later continuity, and that is the fact that in the original toy line, Skeletor was not originally from Eternia, but had come there from another dimension inhabited by other skull-faced people like himself. And in the original toy canon, Skeletor needed the assembled power sword in order to get back to his home dimension so that he could then conquer Eternia. Which is very, very interesting. Now that is the other bit about the power sword. Like I said, He-Man's original standard weapon was the axe. And He-Man and Skeletor originally hold two halves of the power sword, and apparently the power sword only becomes truly powerful or something when you put those two pieces together. So as for Duncan, there isn't a whole lot to him. He's just an inventor who decides to help He-Man in the fight against the bad guys. In fact, the first lineup of the Masters of the Universe toys featured very few characters at all, which is part of the reason why the lore appears so bare. And the only focal point location at the start was Castle Grayskull itself. So the characters featured in that very first lineup were obviously He-Man and Skeletor themselves, Duncan, Beastman, Merman, Stratos, and the Goddess. Alright, so I already said that the Sorceress was not really a character in this very first iteration. And the character Goddess you will better recognize as Teela. But during this very early phase in the toy line's history, this was the identity that she was imbued with. The Goddess. Her name was Teela, and she wore this weird snake thing on her. So in a way she was the guardian of Grayskull, just like the Sorceress would eventually become. But at this point, the Sorceress had not really been established. In fact, weirdly enough, the Sorceress's falcon form, Zoar, actually entered the toy line long before the character Sorceress was officially introduced. And yes, Skeletor's only henchmen at the very beginning were Beastman and Merman. Evil Lyn wasn't introduced until the second lineup of toys. And if you look at the official artwork, you will notice that there is kind of this very primal sense to it. The characters seem to be genuinely fighting for life and death. There are a few cartoony details in there, but for the most part they kind of took it very seriously. And it kind of seems like when Filmation then caught a hold of the property, they started emphasizing that cartoony side of He-Man a lot more. So when did He-Man exactly get his secret identity? Well, technically DC Comics beat Filmation to the punch some while before the Filmation series came out. I'm not entirely sure on the time frame. But the instruction to give He-Man a secret identity originally came from Mattel, and that same instruction was given to both DC and Filmation, which is why Prince Adam's secret identity was also mentioned in the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe series Bible for the television show. So what about that original origin of He-Man being a barbarian warrior from a barbarian tribe? Well, Mattel just flat out retconned it. That's exactly what I'm talking about when I say that the toy line canon was fluid. Older pre-established details from the toy line would very, very quickly get pushed aside as the toy line evolved and became more popular, and as more media started to gather around it, which would present some contradictions from time to time. This is why inevitably there was a Prince Adam action figure introduced, why there would later be King Randor and Queen Marlena action figures introduced into the toy line. Orko wasn't even a character in these very early renditions of. And like I said, they also integrated the characters from the 1987 live-action movie into the toy line, even though from a story point of view that made absolutely no sense. And Mattel just kept doing this all the way until the original Masters of the Universe toy line was discontinued in 1989, and they only really hit the hard reboot button on it when they then started the New Adventures of He-Man toy line the following year. And to go back to Teela just a little bit, like I said, in those early mini-comics, they almost always defaulted to calling her the Goddess, because I suppose that was her kind of superhero name. But as time went on, the character started to be referred to as Teela more and more. It's interesting that she was presented with the Cobra hood originally, because of course as the series went on, reptilian things like Snake Mountain and such would eventually become so associated with the villains. And it's also interesting because in these early versions, Teela is not represented as being the foster daughter of Man-at-Arms. So what do I think of the original Masters of the Universe canon as it stands? I gotta be honest that I am not a big fan of it. Now obviously this is a very, very rough version of Masters of the Universe. It's very incomplete, and I also can understand why it's so bare bones. After all, Mattel wasn't trying to create an intricate lore for the character originally. They were just giving a basic background for most of the characters, because ultimately what they were doing was selling toys. And kids have a huge imagination, so overburdening the toy line with a bunch of lore wouldn't have made a lot of sense. But I also just find it kind of hilarious how very little Mattel cared about any kind of consistency or coherence with the storyline. I mean, as crazy as the Filmation show is, there is at least a hint of continuity in it, while the original Mattel toy line was a fucking free-for-all and anything could happen. I mean, hell, that's the reason why the Horde was created. They didn't originally have anything to do with She-Ra. Mattel just kind of got sick and tired of using Skeletor as the lead villain and decided that they wanted to introduce a new lineup of bad guys to go up against He-Man. Now, my main takeaway from the mini-comics is that I think the artwork is actually really nice. It looks great, the characters are very visceral, but there is also kind of a cold lack of characterization that imbues some of these characters. That might just be because I am so attached to the Filmation versions of these characters that this more darker take on them just feels a little depersonalized. But from a strictly aesthetic point of view, I do think the mini-comics actually look really nice. So yeah, maybe give them a whirl. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Sorry if this was a little rambly and difficult to follow. Until next time, I have the power, so can you.